Hey everybody, this is not the video I wanted to make on this game, but this is the video that I have to make on this game. This is the 2017 reboot of Prey. It has absolutely nothing to do with the previous game, and it was basically just Bethesda forcing the Prey name on Arkane Studios instead of something that would have actually made more sense, like, I don't know, Neuroshock or something along those lines. Because to put it simply, Prey was a rather straightforward first-person shooter that still wasn't a very good game, but at least it tried something different, and it was interesting even if it wasn't a very good game. This game, on the other hand, is Arkane's attempt at making a sort of System Shock or Bioshock-esque game, hence why I say it would make more sense to title it something like Neuroshock. It is a game that I have been attempting to play through and review on and off for several years now. It started before I got the current PC, and this was right around when the old power supply in that previous PC was starting to fail on me, so I was having all manner of weird and irritating issues with the game. And eventually I just decided, you know what, I'm going to hold off on this for now. When I end up building a new PC, because at that time I was already thinking about building a new one, then I will go ahead and try it on the new PC, and then we'll start over fresh, and we'll be able to get this video done. In the meantime, because I follow people who are into System Shock, Thief, Deus Ex, Dishonored, all that sort of thing, I kept seeing more and more and more praise being heaped upon the game, acting like it is this kind of misunderstood masterpiece, and it didn't deserve the poor sales that it got, and so on and so forth. And of course, along the ride, there was the whole immersive sim bullshit, and I've already made an entire video on that. If you're interested, I'll go ahead and throw up a link to that. But short version there is exactly what the video's title is, that the term immersive sim is really stupid and you shouldn't use it. When you describe a game as immersive sim to an average person, they're going to have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, and they will probably think you're referring to something like Flight Simulator or any of those job simulation games and think, oh, that sounds really boring, and they're not going to be interested in it. And I legitimately have no idea why it is so difficult for proponents of the term immersive sim to understand what level of self-sabotage they are committing by continually trying to make it a thing. Anyway, that's enough rambling about the term immersive sim for now. Again, I have a whole video about that if you're interested. Point is that the discourse around this game is generally something along the lines of it being a misunderstood masterpiece that everybody needs to play, and it's a paragon of immersive sim gameplay, and that it didn't actually deserve its weak sales, and so on and so forth. So by the time I actually got a chance to mess around with this thing on the new PC, when everything was stable, the game was running smoothly, the general perception of Prey 2017 had trended largely positive. Which is why Prey 2017 is actually a completely bewildering mess of a game. You see, it's unfortunately not all that unusual for an otherwise strong game to not sell especially well or have serious technical issues on launch that do eventually get sorted out, but ultimately mean that when the game is originally released, it doesn't get the recognition it truly deserves. And so before I really started messing around with the game on the new rig, I figured this was one of those situations where lots of events were just conspiring against the game in general. Things like the name having absolutely nothing to do with the 2006 Prey, and people being rather justifiably irritated over that, considering that there was a Prey 2 in development, and Bethesda ended up canceling it and basically kicking what was left of Human Head Studios to the curb, and then just slapping the Prey moniker on a game that had absolutely nothing to do with the original game and would have been much better served with a completely different name. Or of course it being a relatively niche game, or the technical issues on launch leading to people saying, well, maybe I'll take another look at it when it's had time to get patched, or any number of things like that. I mean, I knew from my time with the game on the previous PC that it had some issues, and I didn't really give it enough time to truly be able to assess the game and understand what made it tick and all that sort of thing. So then we fast forward to when I'm running it on the new PC. It's running buttery smooth. I'm not running into any significant performance or technical issues. And while it did annoy me that the game has a lowered point of aim by default, at least you can go into the config files and make a few quick edits, and now you've got a centered point of aim and everything works perfectly fine if you do that. So while it's annoying, at least it wasn't a situation like with Hunt Showdown where it should have been something in the game from the very beginning and there was no way to change it until they deigned to patch it in years later. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, this'll probably work out pretty well. After all, it's in the same vein as System Shock and BioShock, it's by Arkane Studios, sounds like a recipe for success. And so I dove into the game head first, thinking that since this game's right up my alley, that I would be able to enjoy it, and even if I did have some issues, I would still be able to rate the game highly and be able to recommend it to my audience. And yet, the more I played it, the more reality set in, and the more I felt like I had been outright lied to by the constant exhortations of the game's supposed virtues. You see, proponents of this game will cite things like the amount of options you have for exploration, puzzle solving, combat as a significant positive and proof that this is supposedly the best so-called immersive sim ever made. Where you can certainly take things directly, you can run in and start blasting things with the shotgun, the pistol, etc. You can certainly take things more stealthily and sneak around enemies and try to avoid combat. You can do a combination thereof. You can use mimic powers to find creative solutions to puzzles. You can use the glue gun to create platforms to jump around on, or of course block off flaming pipes and things like that. And of course there's always the classic general skills, things like being able to lift heavy objects and move them around or throw them at enemies, or being able to hack into computers or into doors and things like that in order to find a way to progress. And the game does offer all of these things, and it does support all of these things in nearly every instance. Sometimes you won't be able to get to a certain location if you don't have certain skills, but you might still be able to get around where you're trying to go, and you'll never be locked out of a critical path just because you spec'd into one particular skill or another. And that's all well and good. The game is very tightly designed in that way. And I've certainly praised games in the past for doing so, including Arkane Studios games. The thing people tend to forget, however, is the presence or mere existence of a generally positive thing in, say, a game, a book, a movie, whatever, does not automatically make that thing good. To give you a rather recent example, think about something like Starfield. If you look at that game purely as a list of features, it probably sounds great. I mean, it's got free-form character development where you can spec your character out however you want. You have a robust character creation system where you can sculpt them to look how you want them to look, as well as set up a background for them. You've got first-person shooter mixed with role-playing game mechanics. You've got stealth, so you've got multiple options for going through different areas and achieving different results. They allow you to make different decisions that might lead to different outcomes. There's a robust shipbuilding system where you can customize the ships the way you really want them to. You can build your own outposts on any planet and set those up the way you want them to be set up. You can recruit different crew members to not only serve on your ship, but also serve in the outposts. There are major companion characters who can accompany you on your various adventures, and you can grow your relationship with them and maybe even pursue romance with them. And there's a storyline centered around mystery, intrigue, and exploration. All of that probably sounds really good when you just list it all out. But when you actually start delving into the particulars and you start seeing it for what it is, you realize just how absolutely atrocious of a game Starfield actually is. And I guess shameless plug for my Starfield review. If you haven't seen that yet, I'll go ahead and throw up a link to that if you're interested. But anyway, point here is that the existence of a particular generally positive idea or mechanic in something does not automatically make that thing good. Video games in particular are very much a sum of their parts situation. You need to take a look at the entire thing all brought together rather than just one or two particular elements and laser focus in on them. And I think that's where people really get tripped up on Prey 2017. You see constant praise being heaped upon it for all of these options without really delving into the particulars very much. They'll just kind of gloss over how you have all these different options options, it's so much player freedom, so much interactivity with the world around you, and they'll ignore how a lot of the station just isn't very interesting to explore, either conceptually, visually, or even just mechanically, and they'll also ignore how you're almost never actually incentivized to explore because the rewards for exploration are so minimal at absolute best. I mean, you don't even really get any interesting story or lore beats by exploring. I mean, sure, you find tons of text logs, whether it be emails or just actual text entries or even just audio logs or whatever, but rather than enhancing the atmosphere, enhancing the environment, enhancing your understanding of the story, it's just filler. It's completely inconsequential information that reveals absolutely nothing new, fills in absolutely nothing you are interested about, and for the most part isn't even interestingly written. Almost everything about the story is revealed to you within the first roughly hour or so of gameplay, and this is a something like 15 to 30 hour long game depending on how much side content you do. And the only real curveball they throw at you the entire time is at the very end of the game, and spoiler alert for those of you who haven't played through the game yet, I'll go ahead and throw up a little time code so you can skip ahead here. But the big twist here is that none of the things you were doing the entire game were actually real. You're just a Typhon organism construct that the scientists were experimenting on to see if they could achieve some sort of favorable outcome, because the Typhon organism is currently invading Earth, and the humans need to know whether it's something that they can be able to live alongside, or whether they need to exterminate it in order to survive. It's an incredibly cheap twist ending that's made all the worse by how much of the game is just filler content to begin with. You end up feeling like everything you're doing is absolutely pointless. And the sad part is that it largely is pointless. Most of this game is just filler content. You get basically nothing new in terms of storyline from the very beginning. It's just, you wake up and find out that you've been undergoing simulations for the past 3 years as part of a study on neuromods to determine the effects of adding and removing them on a regular basis and such, and now all hell is broken loose because the Typhon organism has escaped containment and has more or less taken over the station, and you're given the choice of following either your brother Alex's instructions to activate a device to cleanse the station of the Typhon exclusively but save the station itself, preserving all of their research in the process, or you follow the AI January's instructions and ultimately you're going to destroy the research station to contain everything. And that's it. It's very simple, very straightforward. There's no mysteries to uncover, there's no additional twists, other than of course the one at the very end of the game that pretty much everybody hated. And while there is certainly information about the setting itself to uncover through those text and audio logs I mentioned, almost none of it is actually relevant to anything you're doing as you wander around the station trying to complete objectives. And since so much of the station is just composed of laboratories and maybe some industrial corridor type areas, most of that information isn't even actually all that relevant to the environments themselves. It might help to explain what they might have been doing there, but you can't really just look at a place and get an idea of what they were doing there just based on looking at it or listening to it alone. And if you look at the audio or the text logs, you're really not invited to think more about the setting itself. You just go, oh, okay, whatever, and then you just move on to the next thing. The unfortunate reality of Prey 2017 is that for all of the options it gives you mechanically, there's very little narratively to keep you interested in why you're using those options. I mean, you don't even really get a compelling antagonist to keep you going through the game. There's just the Typhon organism, which takes on a bunch of different shapes with different mechanical capabilities, but at the end of the day, they're just black blobs in various shapes that aren't interesting from a visual standpoint, and certainly not from an audio standpoint either, and regardless of whether you're trying to sneak around them or directly fight them, they're just not interesting. I mean, sure, the mimics are a neat idea at first, but very quickly that idea loses its luster, and once you get the scanning tool that allows you to just instantly see where any of the mimics are in the environment, as long as you have that turned on, they become downright trivial, and any of the jump scare value they had is completely thrown out the window. And jump scare value is pretty much the only value that the Typhon organisms have. The rest of the forms just wander around the environments. They're very easy to spot and very easy to avoid most of the time. And even if they're not relatively easy to avoid, you can just run up and start blasting them with a shotgun or whatever. They're going to be bullet sponges. They're not fun to fight in the slightest. But unless you're playing on the harder difficulty settings where it just increases the amount of damage they do, getting into direct combat with any of these Typhon organisms really isn't all that difficult. It's tedious as all hell, but the enemy AI is too dumb to really pose all that much of a threat to you beyond a simple matter of numbers. Do you have enough ammunition to deal with their large and bloated health pools and the amount of damage resistance they have before they can hit you enough times to bottom out your health and exhaust all of your healing items? It's just really strange that in a game that is ostensibly supposed to be horror, or at the very least horror themed, the enemies themselves are really not all that threatening and really just come across more as a nuisance than anything else. I mean, think about it this way. There is a Typhon organism in this game called the Nightmare. It is the most powerful creature you will encounter on the station, and it is specifically sent in to hunt you down. It has an absolutely massive health pool and very high damage resistances, and it can attack you both in melee and with homing projectiles that do very large amounts of damage to you. And whenever it shows up, you immediately get a new objective, which is to either evade it for 3 minutes, or to destroy it. Now, if you try to destroy it, then you're probably going to waste almost all of your ammunition, if not all of your ammunition, because again, it just has an absolutely massive health pool. But in theory, that is the better option, because if you manage to evade it for 3 minutes, then it will disappear for 20 minutes. And then it will come back after 20 minutes have elapsed, and you'll have to repeat the process. The thing is that if you destroy it, then you waste all of your ammunition, only for it to go away for 30 minutes and then come back. You see, there's no way to permanently get rid of the Nightmare. You just have to evade it or destroy it every 20 or 30 minutes, depending on what your previous dealing with it was. And while the idea was clearly to increase the amount of tension in the game and to lean more into the horror atmosphere that they were attempting to go for, all the Nightmare does is become incredibly annoying. Because whenever it shows up, it starts immediately hunting you down, and it will eventually find you unless you find a hiding spot that it simply can't get to. Thus, whenever the Nightmare shows up, you just have to drop whatever it was you were currently doing, no matter what it was, and just go find a hiding spot or go deal with the problem directly, just to earn yourself another 20 to 30 minutes of actually doing what you wanted to do in the first place. It has pretty much the exact opposite effect of what the developers intended. Rather than being this pulse-pounding, exciting, and terrifying situation, it's just really tedious and annoying. And you know what's even more annoying than the actual mechanical outcome of the Nightmare showing up? It's the design of the creature itself. It's basically a phantom, but really big. Phantoms are humanoid-ish shaped Typhon organisms, so they're still large black blobs, but they look vaguely humanoid shaped. And the Nightmare is more or less just that, but scaled up by quite a lot. Much like all the other enemy designs in this game, it's just completely uninteresting. And that's the problem you run into with Prey 2017. It's not necessarily that the game is outright bad, it's just that apart from the amount of options you're given for navigating and puzzle solving and that sort of thing, it's just not an interesting game. It doesn't have anything to compel you from a narrative standpoint. The so-called horror elements are so lacking that the game just becomes downright tedious whenever it tries to be more of a horror game. The FPS combat mechanics are quite basic. They're not particularly bad, but they're not particularly good either, and since everything's a bullet sponge, it just makes combat pretty boring. The stealth system is not particularly engaging. It's, again, quite basic. Just crouch and stay out of line of sight like you do in pretty much any other game these days. Most of the powers are fairly straightforward and not all that interesting. There's only a couple that really shake the mold a bit, and they end up being more gimmicks than anything else, like being able to mimic things yourself. And the setting simply doesn't come alive like you would expect in a game like this, like it does in, say, System Shock or BioShock. It's all just very bland and sterile. It reminds me of an actual laboratory environment where you don't want anything to stand out. You don't want any impurities because that might mess with the research. It actually feels exactly like that trying to play Prey 2017. Like it's some sort of academic study on giving the player options for navigating and interacting with the environment, and everything else about the game was secondary at best, but mostly just more tertiary. And there's no amount of options for environmental interaction that is ever going to compensate for the game effectively having no soul. I know that probably sounds weird coming from me, considering how objective I try to be whenever I'm covering games, but there is always a strongly subjective element to any game you might be playing. They are ultimately artistic works after all. And that's what's ultimately so lacking in Prey 2017. It's not just that the title is bad, it's not just that the sequel expectations from the original Prey were obviously completely thrown into the wood chipper when Bethesda just slapped the name on what should have been titled something like Neuroshock. It's not just that the game had a few technical issues on launch, it's not just that the immersive sim discourse obviously bit into the marketing, and the marketing in general was garbage for it. It's not just that the ending is garbage, and it's not even that general audiences aren't necessarily conducive towards a slower-paced, methodical game like Prey is ultimately striving to be. It's that Prey 2017 ultimately feels like it's just a research paper rather than a video game. Like they just wanted to do a clinical study on environmental interactivity in a video game environment and focused exclusively on that to the detriment of everything else. The end result is that while, sure, it does have this level of environmental interactivity that we really don't see with other games, everything else about it is just bland, sterile, uninteresting, boring. And being boring is the absolute worst sin a video game can commit. Because that means that that particular game has failed fundamentally at its task of being entertainment. Entertainment is supposed to be entertaining. Whether that's good, whether that's bad, it can still be entertaining. A bad game can still be entertaining. Look at something like Ride to Hell Retribution. I gave that game a 0 out of 5. It is the worst game I have ever covered on the channel, and it is one of the worst games ever made. And yet it is so terrible, it is hilarious. It is entertaining in how terrible it is. Prey 2017, on the other hand, is not entertaining. It's just boring. And as such, while it is not an outright bad game, I cannot recommend it to anyone, and I am thoroughly tired of seeing people acting like it's some sort of masterpiece, when it's abundantly clear that Prey 2017 is nothing remotely resembling a masterpiece. Thank you all very much for watching, and for those of you who've been waiting for me to get a review of Prey 2017 done, sorry this isn't a full review of the game, but unfortunately that's just how things work out sometimes. Regardless, I hope you found the video informative, or maybe even entertaining, depending on how you like this kind of stuff. And if nothing else, you might be able to be amused by the slew of comments that I will inevitably get saying things like, oh, well, DW, you just don't get Prey 2017, or, oh, it's just not for you, or it's just not your kind of game, or something like, oh, well, just go back to Call of Duty, or some other complete bullshit like that, because that's inevitable whenever I criticize something that's popular among a particularly insular group. But hopefully there'll still at least be some interesting conversations in the comments anyway. Anyway, thank you all again for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thanks again for watching, and for the rest of the month of October, I'm going to be looking into some more games that are a bit more appropriate for the spooky season, some more horror-themed stuff, if not necessarily outright horror games, so stay tuned for that, and I'll see you all in later videos.